A party is not very democratic because people can't contribute to it. So I'm Sonia Sarangi. I'm a co-director at Atelier Red+Black. We're an emerging practice in Fitzroy. I am a mother, a photographer, also a tutor. That sums me up. My interpretation of a party is that it is the fermented outcome of a thought process. To me, it is not the beginning of the idea, it is actually a midpoint. But what makes it different from the rest of the process is probably one of the first visual representations of the idea. Before that, the idea is just, or concept, is just percolating away in our minds. As architects, I would imagine most of us are visual creatures. Problem with being a visual creature is that you get seduced by images very easily, and they tend to really impact your psyche. That is exactly why we discard our sketches, because we find that we ended up falling into the trap of being limited by what was done, and that became a sort of chain around our neck and kind of cloistered our thinking. By not treating them very preciously and discarding them, we were much more willing to let the idea grow beyond where it started. Because of photography, I've become aware of the power, but also the danger of the image. Photography actually has made me aware of how limiting an image actually is, because an image only gives you one aspect often, particularly when you're looking at architecture, for example, different when you're talking about landscapes. And you can only capture a particular moment in time. I suppose it is actually my knowledge of, in some ways, how much photography can lie, how it can hide in some ways, distract you from things, ask you to focus on certain things. Architecture can't do that. Architecture has to just be there, let your gaze wash over it, you pick what you want to linger over. So I think because of photography, I've become aware of the power, but also the danger of the image. In terms of writing, I think our interest in always writing about architecture has also made us challenge the supremacy of the image. And so I think words have power. And although we live in a time and day where image seems to be powerful, I think words have never lost their power. I think for us, material is one of the biggest starting points to then take that parti and develop it. To us, that is actually the leap from the conceptual to the real, because I cannot imagine a design that feels more facile if material is not an embedded part of its DNA. If that material could be substituted with any other material, why is it there? There's nothing better than designing with constraints, because then you push. But those self-imposed constraints that a material brings is actually fantastic. And then you question, what are the properties of light of that material? What are the limits of that material? What else does that marry with? We tend to go outside, look at what that plan is doing. Then we tend to go back inside, go at what are the limitations of the plan? What are the opportunities in the plan? What are the limitations of the form? What are the opportunities of the form? So it's never about finding the perfect one plan and then going beyond that. It's actually bouncing back and forth. It's amazing how kind of doing this non-linear process takes you to some very interesting endpoints. Yeah, so in that image, what you're seeing is kind of the yellow trace analogy. You're seeing almost 3 overlays in that one image. One of the overlays, and that was in our minds, was looking at that really modest house, that literally 4-room house in the front, and going, well, why must everything that gets added on be so much more in scale in terms of the footprint? So what you'll notice in that image is sort of the width of and the depth of the house is the same as the depth of the addition. So sort of keeping that small footprint idea of the older part of the house, taking that to the DNA of the extension. The other thing you're seeing there, those ceilings in the old house have the most amazing Art Deco motifs in them. And even though section shows it as flat, there's actually a lot of rich detail over there. Another sub-party that we had was going, how do we take that DNA of what's happening on that ceiling plane to the new space, which you can see above me, because a plasterboard was never the answer to those ceilings. Plain flat plasterboard. Third overlay in that party is the thought of going, the hipped roof is quite modest. The eaves have more presence than the actual roof. But when you elevate a hipped roof, it's massive, like an elephant pretending to be an armadillo. So we actually went, let's invert the modesty of that hipped roof, because it's actually quite tall. And we actually notice that the height of the addition, even though it feels much more massive, is not that much more than the hipped roof. It's just that the hipped roof has a much more receding presence. And we were thinking, what's the complete opposite end of that spectrum? And that opposite end of that spectrum would be a butterfly roof. It's sad how all that volume within a hipped roof, so much of it is unusable. It felt like such a waste in a urban context, because res code only gives you so much space. So it just felt like if one has a roof form, one should almost exploit it. There are bits in the party which went, we need to take that DNA. And then there were other bits in the party where we're going, we need to challenge that DNA of the older dwelling. The closest analogy to why architecture needs greater diversity with multiple lenses, is that you would never design a building in just one material. Every single building is at least an agglomeration of 15 to 20 different materials. And they each have their role and their strengths and their unique properties that they bring. Copper cannot do what brick does, and vice versa. How can we address the needs, the very diverse needs, from social status to ethnic background to family structures? How do we address that diversity if the people designing for that diverse public is such a narrow subset? Are we truly getting the widest range of ideas if we're just playing with the one material? I think the party is limiting in creating that wider change, because the party ultimately gets filtered through one pair of eyes, which is usually the designers. A party is not very democratic, because people can't contribute to it. I feel you can get a lot more dialogue if you actually sit down and engage with people a lot more. We have tried to make impact at the core of everything we do. So obviously our buildings, it goes without saying, have an impact on the people who live in them. The other ways we see impact is mentoring. The other ways we see as impact is writing as widely as we can to communicate in as simple language how an architect thinks, what an architect can do. And then teaching also comes into that, because, and although I have to be specific, what I'm talking about here is non-design teaching, because I think design is quite fetishized in itself, but I would like to create the impact to students that there is so much to architecture beyond just the design. And so if I were to give them interesting ways of thinking about space and the past and the future, I think that would be a much more well-rounded architect. And I would love to see more of those in the profession, rather than people who can just push form and material to their limits. Design is so much more than the drawings and the final photographs, which is what you see as the output of architects. So much more happens that is completely unglamorous. And I think as a profession, we don't like talking about it. So for instance, so much of my role as an architect is to negotiate, is to encourage, is to challenge but gently, to tease things out of people, whether it be clients or builders. There's a big portion which is not design, which is negotiation. The other bit that I think often gets lost in the almost fetishizing of design over other things is about just how much time is spent resolving issues, such as during construction. Because construction is not for the faint-hearted. Construction, it is like going on a quest with no map, is how I can best describe it. there's going to be surprises along the way. And so if you as a designer are not able to adapt and reconcile that and think quickly on your feet, again, you cannot end up with a successful piece of architecture. So I think the best architects have always done that. And maybe they've often always even spoken about it. But because that is not very engaging and glamorous to talk about, I think that often gets edited or curated out in the process of presenting architecture as that product, which is the drawing and the image. We often present the party in words because firstly, you have to realize both the general public often, as well as our clients, most clients can't read architectural drawings very well. We do always try to translate the party into words. And of course, we try to translate them always into non-archi speak words. When it comes to archi speak, look, I probably have a very outsider's perspective, which I'm not apologetic about because English is not my first language. So as someone who comes to it as a second language, I question a lot. And I do remember once they start, my introduction to archi-speak in university going, why do we speak this way? Why do we need to create this whole other language to talk between ourselves? So I've never drank the archi-speak Kool-Aid too strongly. And I think that is probably one of the biggest hurdles in terms of getting the general public to understand what we do. It is quite embarrassing to often encounter a member of the general public, an Uber driver or a shopkeeper, and you tell them you're an architect and they go, what does an architect do? So we've clearly done this whole ourselves. And if we don't shed that pretty rapidly, I think we are already in the danger of being quite marginalized, but we just paint ourselves into a corner further and further. So I think a verbal party or, a written party is very powerful. Words matter. In general, I find within our practice, when we do present a verbal party to our clients, we try to be brief and try to whittle it down to 3 to 4 sentences, a paragraph, because that really sticks. And if you can get that to really filter through and resonate, what we often find is that along the process, the client sort of captures that, or the public, for example, if you can do that for a public building. If they've taken that to heart, they will fight for your project as much as you will. And they will want you to see it through and be true to the words that they've taken ownership of. Because we see value in being brief and having a simple message that people can really file away in their hearts or minds.